Joining us on the first edition of the Off the Air podcast is a Fordham alum, WFUV alum, class of 2009, and the radio voice of the Vegas Golden Knights, Dan Duva. Dan, thanks so much for taking the time today.
It's my pleasure, Emmanuel and Jackson. Good to be with you guys. How are you?
Doing pretty well. That's where we were going to start. How's this quarantine and this entire pandemic treating you specifically?
Well, it's hard to wrap your mind around the whole thing. When it started, you had no idea how long it would last, and now that it's been a few months, we start to get antsy about when things might get closer to normal, and at least there is some future to look forward to as it relates to the National Hockey League, that they've got phases to implement and return to play scenario. I was more excited for that Gary Bettman press conference than probably every other Gary Bettman press conference I've ever heard. But I was really surprised at myself at how excited I was. I felt the juices flowing, and I had to break out my notes and my colored markers and start to get ready for some hockey. But I think that in filling the time here, we all look for different ways of how to keep ourselves busy, how we can make ourselves better, and that might be professionally, it might be personally. And I have now 5 times successfully baked chocolate chip banana bread.
Wow.
That's right. Wow is the appropriate reaction. Thank you.
I wish I could say the same for myself.
Dan, on the professional front, what are some of those ways you've been trying to get better during this time?
Well, I think that I knew that going back into the archives would be helpful in 2 ways with the Golden Knights. They had interest in re-airing old broadcasts, all of 3 seasons worth of games. But whereas our TV folks thought they'd just kind of go back over the last 3 years and pick some of the more memorable games, remember that the TV folks with the Golden Knights TV station, which is AT&T Sportsnet, they don't have the playoff games like we have on the radio. So I decided on the radio the best course would be chronological. Start the beginning of the franchise, October 2017, and remember that they won all those games in October, the first 3 and the home opener, and just an incredible month of October. And then, right through December, they were the best team in hockey. They beat the Tampa Bay Lightning. So to go through some of those games and then into the spring and the run to the Stanley Cup Final. Right now, as those radio replays continue, the Golden Knights have just swept the Los Angeles Kings, and they're ready to take on the Sharks in the second round. So it's been fun to go back, and I have personally cut up those games and putting them together, getting them ready for re-air to insert new commercials and rejoins and that sort of stuff. So in the process of going back through the original raw recordings, I've had the occasion to hear some things I didn't remember, and then to relive some of the stuff that I wanted to hear again. And as a broadcaster who's constantly trying to improve, you cringe. Oh my! How did I say that? Why did you not do this? You could have taken the conversation in that direction. Why didn't you tell this story? That's you didn't really capture the spirit of the thing. You weren't descriptive enough there. How come you're not giving me the score more often? So all of those things happen when you're listening to tapes on a regular basis. But then normally you kind of, okay, well, I'll get back into form my next broadcast. Well, there is no next broadcast right now. It's been a few months of just listening to these old games without too much opportunity to get back in the flow of it. But there are occasions where I think, yeah, that sounded okay. That was pretty good. So there's that. And then, deeper into it, I have these VHS tapes from when I was in high school in Ridgewood, New Jersey, broadcasting football, hockey, lacrosse, etc. And somebody's got to digitize these tapes so they're not lost to history. So that has been fun to dig back into those archives. And that is truly cringeworthy. It's almost like watching a different person, on the screen. More hair that person had, though, so I don't mind that. But I think that's been fun. And aside from broadcasting, I enjoy reading, even if it's not directly related to sports broadcasting or even sports. I think that there's a lot we can learn from history, and I love autobiographies, and you name it. There aren't too many books where I'm going to say, no, I don't want to read that if it's a nonfiction book. And documentaries, too. Anything Ken Burns does, fantastic. I've enjoyed listening to podcasts that I have enjoyed, but getting to listen to them more frequently. So there's a lot of stuff, and I write too. I try to keep in touch with people, and it's phone calls or Zoom chats or emails, whatever it might be. So there's always something to keep me busy. I think that I could probably do a better job of sticking to a schedule, though. That's that's part of. They've reopened my gym too, so that's been nice.
Well, Dan, I mean, now almost a little more than 2.5 years into your Vegas Golden Knights career in terms of broadcasting. I mean, you've been through some pretty crazy moments. I mean, obviously you mentioned the Cup run. You think of last year, probably the craziest game of the entire NHL season was Game 7 of that first round between Vegas and San Jose. But, I mean, probably the craziest moment for you maybe has to be the day you find out the season stops due to a global pandemic. Take us through that experience and what's going through your head at that point.
Right. Well, it was mid-March, and the Golden Knights were in the midst of 5 consecutive road games. And it started with the Knights playing in, Winnipeg, Calgary, and Edmonton. And oddly, we came back to Las Vegas for a couple of days in the middle of this 5-game trek. So we played those 3 games in those 3 cities. Then we came back to Vegas, and then we're flying back out onto the road with St. Paul, Minnesota as the next destination. And as we took off for St. Paul, and I forget the exact date, I guess it was the 10th of March, we landed in St. Paul, and I had, coincidentally, a podcast recording with Sean Aronson scheduled for that evening at the team hotel. And as soon as that recording concluded, I was walking to a restaurant for dinner to meet up with some folks, and I looked at my phone and saw some of the college basketball news that was coming out, the Rudy Gobert news that was coming out, and in this very short walk from the hotel to the restaurant, the avalanche of news hit me that, boy, this is going to impact how the NHL goes forward. And the rest of that evening was communicating with my colleagues with the Golden Knights and hockey folks, media folks, players. And ultimately, the question that we posed to some of our high-placed connections was, do we have a green light? As we sat at the hotel bar. And the answer was yes, because it seemed all too likely that the NHL would be paused. When we woke up in the morning, we got the news that there would be no morning skates, no team meetings, and that was just the preliminary announcement, which we knew would then become no games tonight. And Gary Bettman had a call at 1 o'clock Eastern time. We were in St. Paul, so 12 noon Central time. And that call was held not so much to poll the owners, but just to make sure that everybody was on board with the plan the commissioner had laid out as he made the rounds on the phone calls. And I can only imagine the work that the commissioner's office did in the hours leading up to that call. But there was consent, there was no dissent, and the NHL was paused. And that's where we have been since. That call happens. We hear the news shortly thereafter. There was an announcement from the Golden Knights internally, but there was, by that point, media reports. And then we had to arrange to get our charter flight back to Las Vegas, which took several hours. So I walked over to a coffee shop, got a nice cup of coffee and a sandwich, and walked across the street to Subtext Books, got a few paperbacks. I figured I would need something to keep me busy. And now I just wish I had purchased more books.
Speaking of craziness, pandemics, how did WFUV not only shape your career to the extent of preparing you for a job in the NHL, but also all the unexpected things that can come with a job in sports broadcasting?
Yeah, well, I think what's great about WFUV as a station, as the students involved with the overall production of what listeners hear on the air, it's not strictly a sports station. You're surrounded by people who are involved in news, people who are involved in music, people who are involved in the community. There are so many connections within WFUV to the university, but so many connections outside the university. That, I think, really helps you feel like you're at a radio station in New York City, immersed in it all, not just in an isolated student radio station that's sort of a bubble. That's not the case at WFUV. That's a real-world experience, but as a student, you might not appreciate that as you're living through it. I think more in retrospect, you recognize, wow, this is not just a great place to learn how to be a broadcaster, but this is New York City, and we're on the air. I mean, you could be scrolling down the dial and come across 90.7 FM, and there we are. So I think that in retrospect has been really valuable to me, all the things that you'll learn that you didn't realize you were learning. I would say a good deal of the learning is active, too, between the broadcast coaches that we've had, Bob Aarons, of course, the legacy of Marty Glickman that is felt through so many in sports broadcasting, and that is manifest in the workshops, the people who come from all sports media backgrounds that speak with the students. I have here, in fact, I made sure that I would have easy access to it. I've got my binder. This is filled with all kinds of notes from WFUV workshop guests. Not all of it. I mean, there's a lot more stuff in there that is, comments on my own broadcast or feedback I've gotten from others and emails and things that I've printed out, articles about sports broadcasting. But a good chunk of what's in that binder came from the WFUV workshops when it's Mike Breen or Bob Costas or whomever it might be that comes to chat with the staff there. I just soaked all of that up. I then kind of wonder, well, if I was taking advantage of it in that way, I hope that everybody else is too. I think that sometimes we have a tendency to just sit back and be consumers like we're watching a show on TV. When in fact, as aspiring journalists, and I include myself in that as an aspiring journalist, we're always trying to get better, and we want to soak in all this knowledge because somebody else might have this great approach, this great mindset, and you might not copy it exactly, but you might take a little bit of something that makes you a better journalist and a better broadcaster. And again, being around all of those great people at WFUV Sports Broadcasting, the workshops, the people at WFUV, but the last category that comes to me, of course, your fellow students, the people that you're working with. So much of what you learn is through the act of doing. It's not just about reading a book or listening to the people around you. That's very important, but you've got to do it. You don't learn to play the piano by watching somebody else do it. You don't learn how to ride a horse by reading about it in a book. You've got to get your fingers on the keyboard. You got to hop on the horse. And as a broadcaster, you've got to get on the air. So I think that experience with so many great people who are friends of mine as students, I think that the way you challenge each other and you learn from each other, I think that's what stands out the most.
Dan, you mentioned the workshops, and it seems like every time I've talked with you or even read about you on the internet, Doc Emmerich is always someone that comes up for you as a mentor, as someone that helped guide you to where you are today. Take us through how you were able to meet him, obviously at a workshop at WFUV, which you've mentioned to us, and take us through that relationship with him.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, there's not a better man in broadcasting than Mike Emmerich. He's an incredible broadcaster, but he's a better person than he is a broadcaster, and I think that tells you everything you need to know. I've learned more about life than I have about hockey broadcasting from Mike Emmerich, just by the way he carries himself and the way he treats other people. I first met Mike Emmerich when I was in high school as an aspiring broadcaster. I'd take a micro cassette tape recorder and sit in the upper levels of the Meadowlands and print out a roster and try to call a Devils Senators game. And I still have a couple of those tapes, and boy, they're rough. But I remember Doc said, always hold on to your first tape, so I still got them. And we would pester Mike Emmerich and Chico Resch, but also Mike Miller and Randy Velishek, who were the Devils radio announcers. And at the Meadowlands, the radio folks were on the upper level, on the last row of the lower level, and the TV folks were in the lower lip of the upper level. So you couldn't see the radio and the TV folks at the same time. So I can remember my buddy Guy Benson, he and I would kind of station ourselves between the two locations to see who was off the air. Who could we bother right now? And that was the first introduction. And, we were a couple of many Devils fans that wanted to talk to the broadcasters. But I think there was a certain recognition there because we were trying to become play-by-play announcers. And that continued, and, you pass along a tape and exchange some emails and get some feedback. And then what you're talking about, Jackson, is there was a particular workshop at WFUV, and Doc came up. And the workshop itself was, I'm sure, very useful to a lot of people. But in particular, I remember walking with Doc from Keating Hall, where the workshop was held, to the Metro North Station. Doc, I guess, was trying to figure out how he was going to get back to Madison Square Garden or wherever he was going, and I figured, hey, I had a little bit of a relationship prior to that, so it seemed appropriate that I could kind of steer him in the right direction. And I'm not sure exactly what questions I asked Doc in that 10-minute walk, but I guess there was something in there that piqued his interest to the point where he recognized I wasn't just doing this as a hobby, that I was expecting to pursue this as a career. And then we continued to see each other. I was covering the Devils for WFUV, so I was at the Rock, when they, I was inside the Prudential Center when they opened the doors on opening night. So that was pretty neat to cover the Devils for WFUV. And then you get to know Doc and the other people with the Devils and with the media. And then, as it turned out, my first full-time job was with the Devils organization in the ECHL, the Trenton Devils. And by that point, Doc and I were, I didn't have, it wasn't strange to send him an email. But the one email I did send was to let him know I had an interview for that job in Trenton, and he called me right after he received the email and gave me a little bit of a pep talk and let me know what it was I needed to go into that interview with, and it worked out. So now all of a sudden, Doc and I were sort of colleagues. I was working for the Devils organization, and I'd go up to Newark and spread the word of the Trenton Devils with the folks who were covering the New Jersey Devils, and they started doing a Trenton Devils segment on the TV broadcast. So here's Doc talking about the players that I had been telling stories about, and I think that resonated with Doc too, and then it's gone on from there to the Syracuse Crunch and the American League, and now here the Vegas Golden Knights. And, that's the Reader's Digest version, I suppose. And Doc's just been a great person to learn from, a great friend. And I'm blessed to recognize him as a friend, but many others, too, in this business. And I could start rattling off the names. I'm sort of self-conscious about that because so many people have been that good to me, and I wouldn't want to leave anybody out. But it's good of you to ask about Doc because he is so important to so many.
Jumping back to what you said about the fellow students and them making FUV what it is, who were some of those key characters when you were in your formative days at Fordham that pushed you to achieve your best?
Wow. Well, what's interesting about that, Emmanuel, is that a number of people who came through WFUV while I was there did not necessarily have the ambition to be play-by-play announcers. Some were behind the scenes, some were producers, some were color commentators, some were talk show hosts, and of course some were play-by-play announcers. But I think that I love the experience of everybody supporting each other. And it wasn't just about a singular game or a singular event. There was constant involvement from everybody who was part of WFUV. So, I think about people, of course, like Ryan Ruocco, who a lot of folks know in the New York area and now across the country because of all the work that he's done. But Bobby Coyle, of course, who was a student manager, and Lou Baricelli, and Alex Middlesworth was a great guy behind the scenes. Dan Murphy and I did a lot of games together. Mike Nastry. I could go on and on with the people who were there. Tim Bassett's another one. I feel terrible because I'm going to forget people. I'm thinking back to different road trips or different games, and sadly, like you have photographs that pop into your mind. The photographs sort of replace some of the actual memories. I don't know if that's good or bad, but there were just so many people that you spent time with, and of course a lot of it is working together. You're in a studio, you're courtside, you're in a press box, but so much of it is also just the airplane rides or the bus rides or sitting at a hotel or, having dinner on the road or hanging out at somebody's apartment, all of those things. Those are the memories that are as meaningful to me as anything. And, just as I sit here, I'm thinking about which memories would be acceptable to recount on the air and which ones I should stay away from because we did have a good time. And I just owe a debt to the people at WFUV who were so good to me and who did challenge me. There's a long list, of then people who had been a year or two ahead of me, or people who are a year or two younger than me, and that sort of a thing. And that's that's what's neat to see how the legacy is passed along from those who had come before to those who've come after, and of course right here to you guys.
Dan, hockey's one of those sports where it's really something I feel like you have to be passionate about to pursue it, just because of the difference in terms of the pace and just the overall how different the game it is to football, basketball, and baseball. And at FUV, I mean, there are obviously so many legends of play-by-play broadcasting in other sports. When it comes to hockey, there really haven't been that many hockey play-by-play guys that go through, and I know people like myself and other guys who are pursuing that. When you think of FUV and hockey and play-by-play, really most people think of you. So when you think about that, and obviously you're very young and you have a long career ahead of you, what do those
Jackson,
words
I
mean?
appreciate that observation. Good job. That's very kind of you. When you say WFUV and you say hockey, I mean, I think of a couple people. I mean, John Ginone is probably the first one, but another guy that's extraordinarily impactful to me was Phil Jubileo. And Phil was a longtime broadcaster for the Bridgeport Sound Tigers in the American Hockey League, and of course a Fordham and WFUV alum. He was there when Marty Glickman was there and learned directly from Marty. And I think that not only did Phil learn about the craft of play-by-play because he's a superb broadcaster, he also embraced the mentality that we just talked about, paying it forward. So when I was at WFUV and Phil was in Bridgeport, he would invite me to go out there, and I could see how he was doing his thing, and I could sit in what I think was Webster Bank Arena at the time, the arena at Harbor Yard there in Bridgeport, and do practice tapes because Fordham, of course, didn't have its own hockey team. And, when I was covering Devils games for WFUV, you've got to cover the game. You can't just sit there with a tape recorder. That might not go over well. So where was a place that I could get a feel for the professional game that I could have access? And that place was Bridgeport, and it was very much thanks to Phil. And though I had done hockey play-by-play in high school, and when I was a student at Syracuse, we covered the Syracuse Stars junior hockey, and I had done quite a bit of hockey, but I had never attempted to really do, minor league hockey before, professional minor league hockey until then. And I believe that the tape that I sent to the Trenton Devils, to the New Jersey Devils, for that job application was a demo tape from a Bridgeport Sound Tigers game. I think it was Hershey against Bridgeport, and I'm sure I have it someplace. So while maybe Phil doesn't have the name recognition of some of the other great WFUV alums, that does not in any way diminish his value to the legacy of WFUV. He's been was especially at those times very helpful in not only giving me the opportunity, but then giving me feedback. And then, it was neat to see him when I was in the American League and the Syracuse Crunch would play the Bridgeport Sound Tigers. That was pretty cool. I think it just goes to show, Jackson, I thought myself more of a baseball person, having played baseball in high school, and by the way, playing baseball in high school, that might be a generous description. I was on the team. I was a very, very average player on a very good high school baseball team, but my dad had played baseball in college. I had covered the Cape Cod Baseball League and had done Fordham baseball, and so I figured baseball. I had a lot of connections there. Maybe that would be my path, maybe in the college game, maybe in the minor leagues. I didn't think that hockey was necessarily going to be it, but I have loved hockey for a long time, and the advice to me at an early age was to just get involved in a bunch of different sports. So while I loved hockey, I wanted to broadcast hockey games, and to me it was just as much a challenge as any other sport. It is a faster game. It is different than the other sports as you described, but I take each sport as its own kind of unique challenge. And now they just keep offering me hockey jobs, so I keep taking them.
You were also one of the few to go to Syracuse, then come to Fordham. One of the few, you may be the only prominent FUV alum to have gone through that trajectory. How do you feel it benefited you to get the experience from both of the nation's preeminent broadcasting schools?
Wow. It is something I have often thought about because I can't imagine it any other way. And it's great for me to have a connection to two great universities with so much history in sports broadcasting and with so many alumni involved in this field. And we've mentioned Marty Glickman a couple of times, but of course he is the origination of the sports broadcasting culture in a lot of ways at both schools. He's not the only guy, of course, but Marty went to Syracuse and was on the football team, on the track team, 1936 Olympics. And because Marty went to Syracuse, Marv Albert went to Syracuse, and on and on and on. Well, of course, Marty then being in New York City and wanting to give back, was working with sports announcers professionally. WFUV was an obvious place that Marty could be involved with, and people knew that too. I think that's what I've realized in more recent years. I just heard Marv Albert recently talking about he knew that Marty was going to work with the students at WFUV. And look what's happened. So I think that there's a legitimacy there that Marty has provided. And then, of course, right through Bob Aarons and the many people who have given back to WFUV. So I think that I feel spoiled in a lot of ways to have the great education from both schools, to have the quote-unquote network of alumni from both schools. I'm not sure that I would prescribe my path to someone graduating from high school, but I wouldn't change my path. If I could do it over again, I'd do it the same way because of the experiences, because of what I've learned. And I would also recognize that you think you know where you stand, but that might just be in a bubble. I thought I knew, okay, when I was in high school, all right, I know where I stand, this is what I'm going to do. I was working for the Yes Network. I was, rubbing shoulders with Ian Eagle and Chris Carino and Mike Breen and Marv Albert, and okay, I'm 17, 18 years old, I'm good. Go to Syracuse, you figure out, how you fit in there. You kind of, I don't want to say master that scenario. That's not right. But you feel like you've got a footing. You know where you stand. The Cape Cod Baseball League, same thing. I was just an incredible experience for me there, and that gives you a sense of where do you stand. But it's different than Syracuse. It's different than the Yes Network. It's different than high school. And same to be said for Fordham and WFUV. And I think that from Fordham there's a direct tangible connection to what I would do next, and that was hockey, covering the Devils. As I mentioned, the Bridgeport Sound Tigers and Phil Jubileo, all of that led directly to having the job with the Devils, and that has been my path. But, somebody said, you have your name on the wall at both schools, and there aren't too many people that can get to go to Fordham or to Syracuse, and I could go on, and if there's a book in the offing one day in the distant future, that'll be a chapter in it for sure, because I'm very proud of both of those places. So I got a section of the closet that's dedicated to orange and another section of the closet that's dedicated to maroon.
Well, Dan, obviously it's been a pleasure to get to know you as well, and you have mentioned so many mentors, obviously, during your time at FUV and during your time at Syracuse as well. We talked about Doc Emmerich already being one of them, but when you were younger, who were those guys that you really looked up to and got you interested in broadcasting?
Yeah, Marv Albert was really the first one. And I was born in '85, right? Oh boy. But I think that the point is that, when you're a kid, you don't really know the announcers' names necessarily. There was no internet. You couldn't look people up. I probably didn't. I remember listening to Mike Francesa and Chris Russo on the radio all the time, but probably didn't know what they actually looked like until the early 2000s. There was no TV broadcast. They weren't putting their pictures in the newspaper. So you really did have that theater of the mind, and broadcasters had this almost magical presence in your life. And then as you grow older and you recognize that there are real people on the air, the real people that are doing these jobs, you get to know who they are and what their paths were. But Marv Albert was the first because he was everywhere. He was doing the Rangers on the radio, the Knicks on TV, the NBA. I just had someone ask me to transfer a VHS tape. It was Marv Albert doing the Pazienza fight in 1991, I think it was. Marv was everywhere. He was the voice of everything. He was on the local news doing the sports. Mike Emmerich doing hockey, of course. Gary Cohen and Bob Murphy on the Mets radio broadcast. Michael Kay and John Sterling on the Yankees radio. But you could go on and on. Like Marty Glickman was still doing the Jets when I was a little kid, and my family's had Jets tickets for a long time. So when I was a little kid, I think Marty's last year was 92. So I couldn't say that I definitively remember thinking, oh, wow, Marty's the best ever. I probably didn't have that conscious thought, but I certainly listened to the Jets on the radio. I remember we turned down the sound on TV so that we could listen to the radio. Going to Jets games in person as a little kid, in the parking lot, you'd turn down the radio. You'd turn up the radio so you could listen to the pregame show and the postgame show. So, all of those things, we were just spoiled being in the New York area with all the great announcers. But I think that the one guy who I got to know well while I was in high school, I mentioned Mike Emmerich, but Ian Eagle was the other guy. And I had interacted with Ian with emails or texting or whatever it was back in the early 2000s. And I was working for the S Network as a runner. So I was seeing Ian on a regular basis during my senior year of high school. And I remember him saying to me when we were talking about what schools to go to, and he had gone to Syracuse and I'd wanted to go to Syracuse. And he said it's not necessarily about where you go to school, it's what you put into the experience that makes it worthwhile. And that had a big effect on me. Well, I was still in high school and broadcasting sports, but what I would do, in college, Syracuse and Fordham and the Cape Cod League, and then professionally. So I got to really admire Ian, not only on a professional basis, watching his work on TV and listening on the radio, because I always had followed it. I knew who he was, of course, but he was also that personal connection that made me want to follow his path in a certain way. And then to recognize that there was no singular best path, that you kind of needed to chart one for yourself. And so maybe that's partly why I split the difference between Syracuse and Fordham, because I didn't want to follow any one person's path. I wanted to make sure that my experience was my own. But I learned that particular lesson from Ian.
Now that you've had some time to jog your memory during this interview, are there a couple of FUV road trip stories that really resonate as some of your favorite memories at Fordham?
Yeah, well, yes, probably. I thought it was neat, just the 1 year like Fordham baseball had made it to the A-10 tournament in Springfield, and we had not traveled for WFUV baseball broadcasts before, but this was something that new. The team was good, and I remember Scott Kwiatkowski being so helpful in making that happen. And I knew a couple of guys who played on the team. That was cool to go on the road for that. There was a women's basketball trip to New Orleans. That was an experience, and but just like to figure out, just walking, say, down Bourbon Street, trying to find some place to eat, and there was a restaurant that we walked into, and they were ready to close, and the waiter, whose name was Carlos, could tell that we were not locals, that we had no idea what we were doing, and even though they were about to close up, he said, "You guys sit over here, and I'll see what we have in the kitchen." And without handing us menus, he just started to bring stuff out to us. And we were eating it before he would tell us what it was. And that was great. I remember being in St. Louis for my birthday one year for a basketball broadcast. And, we had flown out early in the morning. Dan Murphy was doing the color with me on that trip. And, he had called up his dad and say, "Where should we go to eat for Dan's birthday tomorrow?" And he said, "Well, there's this great restaurant. I don't remember where it is, but it's called Tony's." And then I called my dad, whose name is Tony. And I said, "Dad, where should we go to eat for my birthday?" He says, "Well, there's this great restaurant. I don't remember what it's called, but it's right near the arch." They were talking about the same place. And so we went there for dinner and, on and on and on. I'm sure I'm forgetting so many moments. And I hope I wrote some of this down because it's very much a blur. But just the feeling of being courtside at the Rose Hill Gym is special. When you're on a team flight or a team bus and you're just around everybody that's kind of all pulling in the same direction. Those are some pretty neat things where we could be proud. You got to spend time with the people that you were working with, and you could be proud of the work you were doing and celebrate that pride with your coworkers, with your classmates. I'm having a number of moments flash before my mind. It's a very good question, Emmanuel. I might have to sit down and write some of these things out, but I might have to change some of the names.
Dan, before we wrap up, obviously there are so many students now and that want to do this and want to be a part of this profession, and I think that's one of the big things that has changed over the years when it comes to broadcasting is that so many more people want to be a part of it. What would be your biggest advice to kids that are pursuing this at a very young age and college students who are preparing for their next step in this path?
That's an excellent question, Jackson. I'm sure that you're right, that there are more people who want to do this now than ever because it seems more accessible. The technology is there where anyone can start his or her own podcast. You can use your portable recording device, your cell phone, as a way to broadcast. That was not a thing when I was starting into this. I got into this because I loved sports and I loved telling stories. And as both of you know, I can't shut up.
It goes
with
the
business.
business.
Until the producer says it's time for a break. I think that we should, that people getting into this should recognize why is it that you are getting into this business? Is it because you're looking for fame? You're looking for money? You're looking for glory? Is it about you and your brand? I have a hard time with those things. That's not me, and I don't think that's what this profession is about. We happen to be sports broadcasters who do, in my case, a lot of play-by-play, and there is an entertainment factor to that. But there is, at its heart, a reporting factor to this. We are journalists, first and foremost, and if we can report what we see in an entertaining fashion, that is for sure part of the gig. But that should not come at the expense of building your brand as a broadcaster. You've got to be yourself. If it is your personality, hey, it does work for people. Some people go a long way in this business because of their personality, and I don't begrudge them that, but it's not my way. It's not the way I would coach a student who asked me for advice. When you embrace this as a craft and you commit yourself to improving constantly, that you soak in, distill what other people have told you, then you could decide for yourself what kind of a broadcaster you will be, who you are. Some folks might say it takes 10,000 hours. It might take 7 years. It might take 200 games. I don't know what the numbers are, but at some point you become closer to a comfort level that you know more about what you believe in. That is not to say that you don't keep striving to improve. The day you think you're good and you can't get any better is the day that you're done. You've got to constantly aspire to improve. That doesn't mean it's going to be a smooth scale. You're not going to make every game better than the last one. But you can learn something from the work that you do to make it better. You can learn from the people around you. So I think that's on the personal side of it, Jackson. The other essential part of this is to be kind, to have empathy, to think about the other person, and that might be consider the listener. Marty Glickman's tremendous admonition that we all adhere to when we can, consider the listener, that person at the other end of the radio, to make it, an intimate connection. But also, not just consider your listener, consider your engineer, your color commentator, the elevator operator, the coach, the athlete, the people that we interact with each have their own story. Now, that person's story might not make it onto your broadcast, but that doesn't mean you can't give that person your kindness and your respect. So empathy is a big part of this, and the more we can train ourselves to think about other people first, I think that the better we are as people. And so do my Catholic roots show in that? The proud Jesuits of Fordham? Absolutely. But I think that is something that we can all strive toward, to grow professionally and personally, and then try to share that with others.
Dan, a real pleasure having you on, as always, and thanks so much for being our first guest on Off the Air.
Well, thank you very much, Jackson and Emmanuel, and my best wishes to everybody at WFUV and Fordham University. And from Father McShane right on down, it is an exceptional place and an extraordinarily meaningful part of my life, and I will always be connected to WFUV and Fordham University.